Hello everyone and welcome to Total Quilter Monthly for April 2018. My name is Mark Garretts and I'm a National Floriani educator, and this month we're going to be talking about how you can use an existing block, that's one that you've already pieced or maybe has already even seamed into a complete quilt, with Total Quilter and my decorative quilter. Now the first thing you want to do is to take a picture or scan your block into the computer. It's important to take the picture straight on with the lens perfectly parallel to the block, as you can see in the diagram to the right there. If you can't do that with your camera or phone, then scanning, if you have a scanner, makes this really easy, so you should do that if you can. But again, if you're using a phone or camera, it's important to get it straight on. So pinning the block to the wall and using a tripod to hold the camera or the phone will help a lot. You'll get much better results doing that than trying to lean over the block and take the picture. Before you take the picture or scan the block, it's a good idea to mark the top of the block somehow, because even though we think our blocks are completely symmetrical and it wouldn't matter which way we put it down, it really does make a difference, as you'll see when we get into the software. I like to use a piece of embroidery perfection tape to mark my block, as it won't leave a residue on the block. You should leave the tape in place until you have the block and the hoop, then be sure to remove it. So once you have your block loaded into your computer from your scanner or your camera, and it's important, by the way, to save it as an image type file like a JPEG or PNG or TIFF or BMP or something like that, not a PDF. Once you have it loaded and you know where it is, I've put mine on my desktop, then go ahead and start up your quilting software from Floriani. Now, what we're going to cover in this lesson will work with either my decorative quilter or Total Quilter, either one. But I'm going to be showing it to you with Total Quilter, so if you have my decorative quilter, then your icons might look a little bit different. But the concepts are going to be the same. So go ahead and start up your software. For this particular month's lesson, we want to have our grid turned off, and you can do that by coming over here to your grid icon and turn it on or off, and I've turned mine off. And then we want to make sure that we have snap to grid and other things turned off. So what you want to do is come up to your ruler bar here and right click on the ruler. I like to work in inches, and you can see I've got snap to guidelines turned on, so I don't have any guidelines right now, so I'm going to turn that off. And you want to make sure that snap to anchors and snap to grid and everything else is turned off. So go ahead and click that, and since we're not going to be using a grid, we don't have to go in this month and set up our grid, so whatever it is, it really doesn't matter. Next, you'll want to select a thread palette. Now, what you have really doesn't matter, again, for this lesson, but I'm using the Floriani cotton palette here just because there's fewer colors, and it'll automatically select something that kind of works. So I'm just going to leave it on this, but again, for this month's lesson, what thread palette you have down here really doesn't matter. So the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and load in that backdrop file. And the way we do that is with this icon right here, which is our backdrop tool icon. And when you click it, if you just have my decorative quilter, you'll just see backdrop, or it'll just open up the backdrop dialog like you'll see in a minute. But if you have Total Quilter, you will see backdrop and magic block. And what you want to do is select backdrop, and it'll open up this dialog. It generally goes to the default images folder, but like I said, I've got my backdrop loaded on my desktop, so I'm going to go ahead and click desktop here to go to there. If you have it somewhere else, you'll want to navigate up here or over here to wherever you need to find that file that you downloaded. So I'm going to scroll down, and it's called Square and Square Scan here, and I'm going to go ahead and open that up. Now, a couple things. Like I said in the beginning, I put a piece of tape here to show me where the top of the block is, and you can see that my block is not exactly scanned straight. Now, I did that on purpose so that you could see how to line the block up to get it straight, and also how we can resize it here. Now, if you look right here, you'll see that there's a bounding box around this, and over here in my properties box, you'll see that we are working with the backdrop. Now, this is going to happen automatically when you load the backdrop. You'll be able to control all of the things about the backdrop. But should you click the select tool so that your backdrop is no longer selected, you can click on this all day long like I'm doing right now, and you will not select the backdrop. So what you want to do to reselect the backdrop is come back over to your backdrop tool icon and click it. Now it's smart enough to know that you've already got a backdrop loaded, so it's not going to ask you to try and load another one. Instead, what it does is it selects the backdrop, and now we can adjust it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get this rotated so that it is lined up and nice and parallel. And you can do that here with these blue dots that are on the edges here. These are your rotate icons. These would allow you to rotate the block manually, and you would just have to by eyeball get it lined up. But instead, what I'm going to use is a tool that's built in that does this for us automatically. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to right click on the backdrop, and I'm going to click the Define Horizon tool. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, and when I do, you can see that I've got an icon with a little off-kilter block there, and this allows me to line it up. And what I'm going to do is pick a place on my block that I know is perfectly horizontal. And I could do this across the center here, and that's probably a good thing to do. I could do it, say, across this horizontal line right here. I can tell that this one's not totally straight in the block, so I really don't want to use that one. But I'm going to use the one along the bottom here. So what you want to do is find a place on the line, get it precisely on the image section that you know you want to be horizontal as best that you can, and click and drag your mouse over, lining up that line with the block. Now you don't want it down here or anything like that. You want it lined up as close as you can on that line. So that looks pretty good. And when you let off the mouse, it's automatically going to rotate everything so that the block is perfectly lined up on the horizontal plane. And it's hard to see that because other parts of this are going to be off kilter a little bit. I think it's pretty straight. You know what? I'm going to do it again. This time I'm going to do it straight across and see if it changes anything. So I'm going to right click once more, go back to Define Horizon, and I'm going to go from that point to this point as close as I can here, and I'm going to let off the mouse, and that did rotate it just a little bit, and that actually looks a little bit better to me, so we're going to leave it like that. Again, this tape is here to let us know which part of the block is supposed to go up when we get this in the hoop, because you'll see that the block, even though it looks pretty good, is really not completely symmetrical. So if we got everything lined up but we didn't put the block down in the hoop as we had lined it up here, things would not line up when we went to stitch them. So that's the reason for this piece of tape. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to size this block to the scale of exactly what it is. And I know that I've measured across this part of my real block, and I know that that is 6 inches in the real world. So I found a place on my block where I could measure across. Now, it really doesn't matter where you measure as long as you know the dimension. So it could be across this line, could be across the top of here, but I've done my measurement from that point to that point there. Now you'll notice over here in the backdrop controls, my width is at 7.36 and my height is at 7.35, so it's pretty square, but that's actually the measurement from the edge here to here and here to here. So that really has no relationship right now to the real world. It's just the size of the scan that we took. What we really care about is the size of this real block. So what we're going to do one more time is right click on the block, and click Define Scale. Again, it's important to do this before you do anything else because this will leave your backdrop selected. So what I'm going to do is get right in here, and I'm going to click and again drag my line across, and this time I want to be really nice and precise to get it right there where I measured in the real world, and I'm going to let off the mouse, and it's going to tell me in the scan it's 5.56 inches, and here I can change it to whatever the real world dimension is. So I know that the real world dimension is 6. Now this is pretty close for a scan, but when you take it with a camera, it's probably going to be way off. So this is a real important step. So I'm going to type in 6 here and click OK, and that's going to enlarge this so that now this dimension right across here is 6 inches, and it matches the real world. Okay, now you can see on the edges here, part of my paper piecing that I did this block with. This was a paper pieced block, and I'm going to tell you that you just want to ignore this because it really doesn't matter. I hadn't trimmed it out of the paper yet. If I did, you would just see the white of the scanner bed, but here you can see the paper, and since I purposefully put it in the scanner not straight so you could see how to straighten something, you can see this out here, so just ignore that. All right, so now that we've got our block scaled and we've got it aligned to the horizontal plane, now what's in our software should represent the exact real world block that we want to later hoop up and embellish. So let's talk about that. How do we get this block in the hoop aligned to whatever we're going to create in the software? Well, there's lots of things you could do, but we're going to use the built-in alignment marks tool to do that. Now, if I just click the alignment marks tool now, it will not know where to put those alignment marks. So we need to put something in here that tells the software where to put the alignment marks. So the first thing I'm going to do is click my normal select tool so my backdrop is no longer selected. And the alignment tool is right here, but you can see, actually we call it the placement marks. You can see that it's not lit up right now because there's nothing to place to. It needs some kind of a shape, usually a square or rectangle, to place these marks to. And we have a square here, but it's not really part of this quilt block that we're going to start stitching. It's just an image that's on the backdrop that we can start aligning things to. So what we need to do is we need to draw with our drawing tools a square that matches up to the real world square of the quilt block. And the way we're going to do that is with our line tool here. Now we could use our rectangle tool, but if we did that, you would see that this is not actually a rectangle. Even though it looks pretty good, it's not totally rectangular. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to draw this exactly with our line tool. And I'm going to start up here in this corner, and I'm going to, you'll notice that my crosshair has kind of a notch in it if you think of it. I'm going to get that notch lined up right here as best I can with my mouse, and I'm going to click. So I'm left clicking, and I'm going to come over to this corner. Now this has a little tiny bit of fabric notched out of it here, so I could click right here, but what I'm going to do is just estimate where this line would come, and I'm going to click right there, and then I'm going to come down here to this corner and get lined up and click, and I'm going to do the same thing over here and click. And lastly, and I can tell I didn't get that perfect down there. Lastly, I could come back up here and click, but instead what I'm going to do is let the software do that for me by coming over here and clicking the close shape icon, and that'll close that shape up for me. Now, as you said, I didn't get this edge here, this point, just completely perfect. So let's see how to adjust that. the way we adjust it is we come over here to our shape tool and click it, and this will let us move these nodes around that I entered when I used my line tool. So I'm just going to move it in just a hair here and get it really lined up with the real block. I'm having trouble with my mouse here. There we go. That's good. Okay. So it's still not perfect, but you know what? It's close enough because this block is not a real honest square. It's close. It's close enough for when we get into the hoop and get it lined up. So, you know, you're talking about tenths and tenths of millimeters here, which is really not going to make any difference when we start to stitch on this. So once we've got that done, you'll notice that our placement is lit up. So I'm going to go ahead and click that now. And what this is going to do is it's going to stitch in little placement marks wherever I click here to tell it where to align this block in the hoop. So these are going to stitch out first, and then the machine will stop because it's going to be in a different color theoretically, and then we can put our block down in the hoop. So the idea is we will put something in the hoop to hold the block, and if we're just doing the top fabric of the block, we would put a piece usually of nylon no-show mesh. We'd hoop that up, stitch out our placement marks, and then place our block down aligned with those marks and tape it in place with the embroidery perfection tape, the pink tape, in a place where we know we're not going to stitch over the tape. You could also float it there. You could use some stitch perfection tape, which is our water-soluble double-sided sticky tape, on the back side of the block. If you wanted to stitch all the way out to the edge here, that's what you would do, because you definitely do not want to stitch through the embroidery perfection tape. But any way you do it is up to you. So I'm just going to use the corners. You could use all of these. You could use the sides if you want to. However that makes it easy for you to line this block up in the hoop. But I'm just going to click the four corners. So, and it's going to put those in. So now I've got my four corners selected. When I click OK, it's going to put in my marks. Now, they're a little hard to see right now for two reasons. One, I don't have 3D stitch view turned on. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And now you can start to see them a little bit in here. But the color of my backdrop is a little bright and a little dark actually in the corners, so we can't really see those stitches. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fade my backdrop out now so we can see what we're putting over it a little bit easier as we draw lines and click points and things. So to do that, I'm going to reselect my backdrop by clicking the backdrop tool. Remember, we talked about that. And then back over here in my properties, I've got my backdrop properties. Now I've got a slider here that lets me darken and lighten this up. So if I move this slider over, click and move it over to just about there, I think, I'm going to click apply and see how much lighter that gets. That looks pretty good. Let me just make it just a tiny bit lighter and click apply one more time. There we go. That looks good. Now you can see my stitches, and they're pretty well aligned to this block. So again, what would happen is that these alignment marks would stitch out first, and then the machine would stop and you'd put this block down with these alignment marks. And again, we've got our piece of tape on here to show us which side is facing up. And then once we have our block in the hoop, then we would stitch out the rest of the things that we want to stitch. Now, in order to start to stitch some things into this block, we can either add an embroidery design in here, or we could start to put things in the various parts of this block, or we could put a stipple or a texture over the whole block. To put just a simple embroidery design or even a complex one anywhere we want in this block, that's just a simple matter of merging in the stitch file, or we can use some of the built-in things to go over the top. So let's use something that's built in, and we have some built-in things here in our embellishments, and we have some here in our decors, and we have some here in our borders. So let's use an embellishment just to see what that looks like, and we'll go ahead and use one of these butterflies. So if you want to use something else, you can click the drop down and pick a different embellishment, but we're going to go ahead and use this butterfly as an example. So it's going to come in, and we can click and drag it wherever we want. So if we wanted this to stitch out right here, we could, and that's all we need to do. If that's all we want to do with this block, then we would save it in the WAF format, and then good practice is again to save it in the WAF format, and then we would save it again in the stitch format that we need, and go ahead and stitch it out. And again, when we stitched it out, these alignment marks would stitch first, the machine would stop, and then we would stitch out our butterfly. But let's do something a little more complicated. Okay, so I'm actually going to delete this butterfly, and I'm going to do that simply by pressing my delete key right now because I have it selected. So that would show you how to bring in a built-in embroidery file. If you wanted to bring in something that's not built in, you could come to File, and you'd want to click Merge Stitch File, and that would bring in whatever embroidery format file you wanted, even a WAF file. So I'm not going to do that. What we're going to do is something else. So let's say, for example, I wanted to put a texture fill pattern or an advanced stippling pattern here in this piece. Well, I can't do that right now because to do that, I got to use my one-click wonders down here, and you can see they're not lit up. And the reason they're not lit up is they don't have any place to go, because I have this outline right here. I have the big outline that I created. So if I wanted to stipple over this whole block, including the seam allowances, I could do that now. Or if I wanted to put a texture fill over this whole block, including the seam allowances, I could do that now. So let's see how that would work. So let's select that. I'm going to come down here to my advanced stippling, and I'm going to click stipple number 6, and that would put it over the entire block. You know, these stitches here would just be hidden in the seam allowance all the way out to the edge. If I wanted to, I could draw another shape, another square inside that was aligned to my seam allowances, or I could reduce this one by a 1/2 inch on both sides so that my 1/4 inch would then be on each side, and I wouldn't have these stitches in the seam allowances. But I prefer to stitch it full width like this so that any inaccuracies I would have in drawing that inner box will be hidden, because these stitches will just blend into the seam allowance and blend into the sides of the block, and I won't have to, you know, draw a nice line or anything around the inside or put an extra line of run stitches or anything in there. But you know what, I really don't want to do that either. So I'm going to delete that. Again, I'm going to do it by pressing my delete key. What I want to do is take that same texture fill, which I quite like, and I'm just going to apply it to this square in the center here. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to my line tool, and once again, I'm going to click the edges of this, the points of the square, and I'm going to just draw a box that makes the edges of the square. So I can be as precise as I like, but again, this doesn't have to be super precise. No one's going to fault you if a stitch falls inside of this a little bit or outside of this a little bit, because compared to doing this with a sewing machine, which first of all would be impossible, this is super accurate, and people are going to be impressed. Now I've drawn the 3 points here, and I'm going to again automatically close this up by pressing my close icon. Now it looks like that my box was not drawn to the actual edge of the piece of fabric, and in fact it was. What the software is doing is drawing this bounding box around it, and it's always going to try and draw totally straight lines. but if you look close, you'll see that my lines inside are actually not straight. So let me click off of that so you can see the line. So you can see the green lines here are actually up against my block, but they are my piece, but you can tell when I reselect it that they are not really, it's not really a true square. But that's okay because that's where we want our pattern to go. So I'm going to reselect this. I'm going to come back down to my advanced stippling, and I am going to click it. And again, I'm going to reselect stipple number 6 because I think that pattern looks good in this quilt block. And I'm just going to click off it so you can see it, put it in green thread. That's going to be over what is yellow down here. So if we want to see what that will look like, just like it is, we can turn our backdrop back to dark again. We'll do that in just a second. But if you look closely at this, you'll see that right here, there's apparently a gap. And it looks like that there's a row of stitching all the way around this. And there is stitching all the way around this, but this is an artifact of having to go from one row to the next. And right here, it didn't have to actually go along the edge to do that. So in order to kind of close this up and make this look good so this doesn't look so wonky, and you can see it's got a gap here again, what I'm going to do is come back and reselect that artwork. And when you do a change from artwork into that fill in either my decorative quilter or Total Quilter, it really doesn't convert this artwork into the fill. If you start with artwork, it leaves the artwork behind. And that's a really cool thing because it allows us to do what I'm going to do right now, which is to come down and put a run stitch around the edge. And now if we look at it, you'll see that it looks nice and finished. So it's going to come along and put an extra run stitch along the edge. So let's see what that looks like now with the green thread. To do that, again, once I'm going to come over here and select my backdrop tool, and I'm going to move my slider back to dark and click apply. So now if I click off it, you can see what that stitching would look like, because remember I have 3D turned on. You can see kind of what that would look like if I did it in the green thread that it picked, or actually they're calling it slate blue. Let's kind of preview what that would look like in a different color. Let's see what it would look like in, oh, I don't know, let's use this light brown. No, let's use this ecru color. And to do that, I'm just going to select it, click on the ecru color, and it's going to change it. Oh, I'm not sure I like that at all. So let's change the color again. I'm going to reselect those stitches, and I'm going to do that over here in the properties box. And let's change it to red and see what that looks like. So I'm going to click red, and let's click off it to see what that looks like. And you know what? I kind of like the way that looks. So let's leave it like that. Now, if you wanted to put something in these triangles, you could do that. You could draw the triangle just like it is. It's not strictly a triangle. You'd have to kind of come out here. So you'd click here, click here, click up here, click up here, click down here, and then let it automatically connect here, or you could do it in any sequence like that. But if you wanted your stitching to not go out into the seam allowance, this is a little bit of an issue here because you kind of have to estimate where this corner would be here. All right, so in order to do that, what we can do is we can use our guidelines to create that corner for us. And so once again, I'm going to come back and select my backdrop because I want to fade that out to make things easier to see. So I'm going to move it back into the center there approximately and click OK. That looks pretty good. And what I'm going to do now is draw some guidelines in that line up with this point and this point. So I'm going to get a guideline to go horizontally this way and vertically this way. And the way we get a guideline in is we come up to our top ruler and we click and we drag, and that's going to bring in a horizontal guideline. So I'm just going to get it lined up with that point. And I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to do it on the side ruler. That's going to give me a vertical guideline. And I've got that lined up. And you can see now I've got a point here to draw to. Now I can draw manually to that point, which is probably going to be close enough, but I could also come up to my ruler bar and I could right click and say snap to guidelines. Now when I click a point and it's close to this intersection of the two guidelines, it's going to snap to there. So let's go ahead and draw in this triangle now. So I'm going to come back to my line tool, and I'm actually going to start up here. And so I'm going to click right there, and you see I wasn't right on it, but it snapped right to it. Now I could draw a center guideline if I wanted to get nice and precise, so I could draw some across the center that would line up with these. But I'm just going to come right here and eyeball this along this guideline and click. I'm going to come down here and eyeball this one and click. And again, I'm going to come and tell it to automatically close this shape by clicking the close shape icon. And now I've got that triangle in there. Now I could put a pattern in here and it would just stay constrained right to there. So there's some things I could do with this. I could do a contour quilting, which might look good in that triangle. So let me click that, and that's going to contour a shape all the way around into the center. That's probably too tight for most of you quilters. So let's change the density. Let's make it an 8 and click apply. And now we've got a little bit better pattern in there. And let's go ahead and do that. And let's leave that in this tan thread, our light brown thread, and see what that looks like. So I'm going to click off it to unselect it. I'll come back and click my backdrop tool so I can make my backdrop go dark again. I'm going to slide that slider over, click apply, and that looks pretty cool. So I could continue to do that all the way around. You could try and copy and paste and rotate this design over here, but you know there's a chance that it wouldn't line up. It might be close enough, but so you could give that a try, but you'd be better off to, in this case, since our block isn't perfect, to draw another triangle here and again down here and down here. So this is how you would take an existing block, line it up in the hoop, and also create your embellishments or embroidery designs or any combination of anything you want to do with stitches into this hoop, into this block. And so that kind of completes our lesson in the software section. And I want to thank everybody for watching and invite you to come back next month for another set of tips and tricks on Total Quilter.